Welcome viewers to this series of lectures on modern European history, and so far we have tracked the gains with respect to the ideas of liberalism, nationalism and socialism in different parts of Europe, Britain, France and outside Britain and France in other parts of Europe up to 1848. And this particular lecture is about the developments with respect to Central Europe. So, we are trying to figure out how things unfolded leading to 1848 revolution in Central Europe. So, having surveyed the scenario with respect to the liberal gains, the nationalist aspirations, the socialist precipitation, you can say, because it was to emerge as a historical potent force in the second half of the 19th century Europe. So, having surveyed that, let us try and understand as to what was happening in Central Europe with respect to the 1848 revolution. Now, if we keep in mind the Central Europe, so basically what existed as Austria and Germany, Poland, etc. So, that is the geography that we are talking about. The situation here in Central Europe can best be understood with respect to two themes, two very distinct themes. One, you have various nationalities within a particular polity, and obviously the Congress of Vienna had put it all under monarchy, right. The Habsburgs were in rule here. So, it contained various nationalities that by now had started to struggle to assert their own autonomy from within the Austrian Empire, what used to be the big omnibus Austrian Empire under the Habsburg. Now, you have different nationalities who are clamoring to acquire statehood of their own, and that is the power of nationalist ideas that we keep tracking all through 19th century European history. Liberalism, nationalism and socialism as well, with the increased instance and deepening of industrial revolution in various parts of Europe. Second critical theme is the changing relationship between the forces of liberalism and nationalism in Germany. So, in Germany, we get to see the interplay of liberalism and nationalism, and how the forces pushing these two ideas over a period of time, the relationship changes. Something that in our earlier interaction I have spoken of time and again as to how the middle class or the lower middle class, the radicals amongst the middle class, increasingly came to realize that in their fight against or common fight against the monarchical order, they were losing out to the upper middle class, and that's where the idea of socialism comes. That's where industrial revolution and workers' movement starts playing up in history of 19th century Europe. Now, here in Austria and Germany area, the Central European area, as the news of the February Revolution in France spread eastwards, very soon, in a month's time, by March, we find that the Austrian Empire had also split, right. So, why it is getting weakened is because, as I told you earlier, that various nationalities are now clamoring for creation of their own state. Hungary had severed its tenuous links with the Habsburgs, and had started drafting its own constitution. So, the arrangement, the political arrangement of an empire under a monarch was now finding it increasingly difficult to contain the nationalist aspirations of various ethnic groups. And that is how nation states come up in a big way in 19th century history. And that is why I keep repeating that alongside liberalism and socialism, you also have to contend with nationalism as a big potent force influencing history of 19th century Europe. In Vienna, workers and students threw up barricades, again in the Paris style of protest, as I was earlier speaking to you about this, that the imagery of the French Revolution was still very vivid and clear in protesters' mind, and they would almost try to mimic the way protests were carried out, the way barricadings were done as part of the movement. So, similar kind of a thing is seen in Vienna, and they even attacked the palace, which again is so symptomatic of the French revolutionary style of doing things in a movement or in a protest or in a revolution. So much so that Metternich had to flee in disguise to Britain, and this marks a big change. The Habsburg monarch Ferdinand II had to yield to the nationalist demands from Bohemia also. So, earlier we have spoken of Hungary. Now, even Bohemia or Bohemian nationals too are asserting themselves, and Ferdinand II had to grant them its own constitution. Now, it does not stop here. The surge of national sentiments is enveloping more and more areas that earlier were part of the Habsburg Empire under the Congress of Vienna arrangement. Now, in South, the Italians launched attacks against the Austrian held territories, particularly in Milan, in Naples, Venetia and Lombardy, where the forces of the Sardinian ruler King Charles Albert routed the Austrians. So, you find the smaller nationalities located in Milan, Naples, Venetia and Lombardy rising in revolt against the Austrian held territories, and in this they get the military help of the Sardinian ruler King Charles Albert. Now, it is a monarchy versus monarchy. Now, it is a Sardinian ruler and he is a king, and he is supporting national aspiration, national cause against another monarch, right, the Habsburg monarch. Now, what was the 1815 arrangement? What was the Congress of Vienna arrangement? That if there is some uprising, then monarchs of all big countries will come together to help them against such revolutionary changes. But here, lot many things had happened, and say in 20 years' time, nationalism had become such a potent force that the charm of or the glue of a monarchical order was just proving insufficient to bring together the defense of monarchs against the nationalist aspirations. So, that is becoming very clear, and these are the takeaways. If you use a big canvas of historical understanding with respect to nationalism, liberalism and socialism, then this is what is the takeaway from Central Europe. Yet, the forces of national sentiments that had brought Austria to its knees then succeeded in allowing the empire to recoup its fortunes, because very soon, now this is something which is important for us to understand, that once you open up, once you make ethnic homogeneity as or ethnic parameter as the basis of new nation state, or if you fuel national aspirations on your ethnic identity, then the buck does not stop there itself. So at this point of time, you have several nationalities clamoring to get away from the Habsburg control, the Austrian control, but they themselves are not very homogeneous, right? So within the newly created states, there were several other cultural minorities that had started to bitterly complain about their newly institutionalized inferiority, right? So what is to be kept in mind here is that the nationalism, or the idea of nationalism, is not only about the aspiration of ethnic groups or small nationalities to have a state, an independent sovereign state for themselves, in opposition to or by liquidating the earlier existing monarchical order, but nationalism also required to reach out to groups other than the group from where it has all begun. So there has to be some sense of reaching out, there has to be some sense of using the glue of some shared struggle or some shared historical antecedents to have larger group to constitute nationality. So nationality is not localism. Nationalism also contains in itself the ability to move across one's very local identity or regional identity and encompass a bigger group on the basis of historical antecedents, on the basis of some shared cultural heritage or some shared historical movement or some struggle, and that is how it becomes a viable unit. But if it is premised only on one's ethnic identity and the aspirations are mounted merely on a particular ethnic identity, then obviously when a nation state is created, there would be other groups who would not get the kind of democratic representation that they would otherwise have imagined for. And in that case, their inferiority, the other groups, cultural groups' inferiority, becomes institutionalized under this arrangement, and that becomes a crack point, new crack point in these political, you can say, political institutional arrangements. So here from central part of Europe, we have the examples in the form of what was happening in Bohemia. It was a newly created state, all right, outside the Austrian control, the Habsburg control. The anti-German Czech majority were pitted against the German minority, right? And that was a new flashpoint for Bohemia. The resulting animosities, and what you find in 1848 interestingly is that it is these cracks that was very cunningly used by the monarchy to plow itself back to power. So while nationalism brought the Austrian Empire to its knees to begin with around 1848, it simultaneously allowed them to claw back to power, because the buck of nationalism and nationalist aspirations would not stop there itself. So, as you can see, the resulting animosities made it easier for the Austrians that now had a liberal government due to March Revolution in Vienna to take advantage and reassert control in Bohemia, right. And despite being a liberal government, due to economic and political reasons, the Austrian government did not want dismemberment of the empire. So, it would be very naive to say that if the regime is liberal, it will not display empire-like tendencies. The compulsions of economy and politics and strategies and competitiveness can push even liberal governments to not allow dismemberment of an erstwhile empire where Austria had control over larger part of Europe. It therefore, despite being a liberal government, it therefore was quick to restore Lombardy and Venetia to its realm, and their anti-Austrian sentiment, whenever it was found weak, that was the point, that was the time when they struck, right. So, I just spoke to you about how different parts of Italy had asserted themselves on the lines of national sentiments to pull themselves out of Austria. Now, despite being a liberal government in Vienna, Lombardy and Venetia are getting restored, right, because of the internal tussle or the competitive national sentiments that did not stop at one point, it went on and on. Similarly, in Hungary, nationalism and counter-nationalism set the stage for final act of restoration of Austrian hegemony. So, in Hungary area also, whatever areas that the Austrian Empire had lost on account of nationalist aspirations and pressures, the same forces, since it did not, the buck did not stop there, it went on, and it allowed Austria to intervene and intervene timely to pull back those areas into Austrian hegemony again, right. Resultantly, what we find is that Vienna saw the second uprising in October 1848, but by this time the revolution was a spent force, and forces that were loyal to the emperor, assisted by the troops from Russia, descended upon Vienna. The liberal government capitulated on October 31, 1848, and therefore, we find that whatever liberal gains or you can say republican gains that were made in central part of Europe, they were lost, and the traditional order or the monarchies like Russia, etc., could lend help to Austrian Empire, although it was a liberal government. The face of it was that of a liberal government, but the tendencies were the same. Now, once back in power, the imperial government realized that the nationalist movements that they had been so far using to their advantage, now it reckoned to them that though these nationalist movements proved to be advantageous at times, largely or generally they operated to the detriment of the empire's political and economic unit. So, there is again this clarity emerging amongst the conservative politics, that there is a limit to which national sentiments can be used to the advantage of empire building. It therefore embarked upon to suppress nationalist impulses as thoroughly as possible henceforth. Resultantly, the process of nation building, centralization, separate rights of Bohemia, Hungary, etc., they were all gone. And this is the story post 1848, and that is why it is not a very accomplished revolution in that sense, because the gains that were made proved to be momentary, and it gave them enough reasons or enough opportunities to claw back to power, right. So, the upper middle class dominated regimes, political regimes which are liberal in outlook, did not catapult to the radical demands and pressures that were generated during 1848 to begin with, and it could win back its position during the same year. If you look at Prussia, the story appears to be similar. King Ferdinand William IV was compelled to yield to the demands of a popularly elected assembly, obviously under the radical influence, and this assembly proved quite sympathetic to the Polish Prussians, and it proved antagonistic to the Prussian Russians. Now, again you find how ethnicity based nationalism is playing itself out, and how it is being made use of by the existing regime to win itself back to power, right. Hence, we get to see the autonomy being granted to Poland, right, because they are more sympathetic to the Polish Prussians as compared to Prussian Russians, against whom they are quite antagonistic. The German minority obviously resented this, and the Prussian army sided with the Germans and helped them to crush the new government, and this by itself had demonstrated the might of the professionalized army. And therefore, what we get to see is that the revolution in Prussia ending as quickly as it had begun. Now, this is what completes the segment of modern European history discussion up to 1848. So, if you look back at different lectures constituting different segments in terms of time and space, you will discover that from the period 1815 to 1848, we have seen how conservatism or conservative politics tried to claw itself back to power through Congress of Vienna, how middle class assertion led to the dilution of this aspiration, how constitutional monarchy became the arrangement through which the upper middle class tried to exercise its access to the levers of political power, how radicalism of the industrial workers and lower middle class were compelling different regimes to at times to catapult, at times to yield whatever they could, and how the nationalistic aspirations purged on ethnic identities, shorn of its progressive glue, actually led to giving away or losing all the gains that were made in 1848 to begin with, and by the time you come to the end of 1848 revolution, all the gains that were made are undone, because the upper middle class assertion through whatever states that they had, through whatever, it could be monarchy, it could be constitutional monarchy, it could be liberal state, they could do their politics with respect to the ethnic nationalism and claw themselves back to power. So, in that sense, 1848 revolution is not a very glorious chapter in terms of the you can say radical gains, or in terms of the nationalistic aspirations with which it had begun. Subsequently, in the later part of 19th century, these ideas became more potent and the gains made were more formidable, but that was through the integration of different localities and nationalities into a more viable national state units that you can see in the form of, say, Italian unification, German unification, etc. So, that is it for the day about the 1848 revolutionary scenario in Central Europe. Thank you.